Studies program at MIT, Eric Heginbotham, a principal research scientist at MIT's Center for International Studies and a specialist in Asian security issues, and George Gilboy, who serves as the chief representative in Japan for Woodside Energy and is a research fellow at MIT's Center for International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Thank you very much, Maryanne. Fantastic to be with you today.
Thanks. It's a pleasure.
Wonderful. Glad to have you here. Today, we will discuss the recent article on the importance of accurate comparisons of U.S. and Chinese defense spending. And the first one I'm going to address to you, Taylor. Your article provides an approach for conducting a rigorous, objective comparison of the defense spending of the U.S. and China. Now, to set the stage for everyone, can you just tell us briefly what in your mind is the significance of tracking the U.S. and PRC's respective defense spending, and explain a little bit about why it is important for such a comparison to be accurate?
Sure. Thanks so much. And many thanks to the National Committee for making this event possible. I think there are three reasons at the top line. First, right, there's really no excuse for making an inaccurate assessment on anything that's national security related, especially when it's as important as China's military in the context of the rise of and modernization of the People's Liberation Army. Also, right, an accurate assessment plays a critical role in this case, right, in sort of assessing the degree of the challenge that China poses, because one wouldn't really want to overestimate the threat or to underestimate it. And so getting an accurate estimate as possible, right, helps us kind of right size the U.S. response. And thirdly, right, too much focusing on what China is spending it's a distraction from the more important question of how the United States should respond to what China is doing with the modernization of its military and what kind of capabilities the United States should procure. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. Now, the second question for you, Eric. The article mentions that there are multiple previous comparisons of the U.S. and PRC defense spending that are somewhat different. Can you tell us what is it that makes comparative analysis of U.S. and PRC defense spending so challenging? Is it simply a nature of the data environment, a lack of consensus about methodology, or something else?
Thanks, Maryanne. As we point out in the article, assessing defense spending is probably not really as difficult as the current debate and the tenor of the debate might suggest. For the most part, among the majority of people who look at these issues seriously and professionally, disagreement is within a particular band or range of numbers. There are organizations out there, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, that have people who work on this issue full-time. They do it fairly well. We have some differences in our assessment. But the article and much of what prompted us to do the work is that we've seen some folks who, for whatever reason, have come up with some dramatically different figures that are outside of the range that we've seen generally, and who have suggested that Chinese military spending is approaching the level of the United States. It is true that there are challenges here, so I'll speak to some of those. Getting an exact answer is never really going to be possible. There are several reasons. Some are technical, so budgets, defense budgets included, are accounting devices, just like personal income taxes are. Unlike your personal income taxes, though, there are no rules, or at least there are no rules that cross state boundaries as to what exactly should be included. And I want to say this part really, really slowly and clearly. No two states include the same categories when they account for defense. So you will hear sometimes about China's quote-unquote off-budget military items, items that are left out of the Chinese defense budget. And that's true. There are many. It's also not a unique feature to China. It is absolutely universal. It's true of the United States. It's true of others. So there are some technical issues. We can get into issues of transparency, and China does have some real issues there. But on balance, I think the bigger issues, the harder issues, are more conceptual. And in part, these go back to issues of comparing like for like, which we emphasized a lot in the article. And that, in a way, goes to the heart of really what you want to compare when you, or what the point is when you're talking about defense budgets. Are you looking to get a sense of the total level of effort, of the burden on the economy, or are you looking to assess inputs to some particular type of military capability, some ability to do a particular type of thing? And depending on your answer, you may want to include different things in the defense budget. So those are some of the issues in or difficulties in thinking through how you might approach defense budgets or think about defense budgets.
Thank you. So not as hard as some people might think it is, but there are some real challenges. That's really helpful. It's good context. George, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how, in the preparation for this article, you guys worked together to address some of those challenges.
Thanks, Maryanne. Let me just quickly say that here I'm representing my own views and not the views of Woodside, my views as an MIT researcher. I think, as Taylor and Eric noted, look, the main thing is to compare like-for-like categories for both sides if you're going to do a comparison, and to make an appropriate choice about how to convert currency, right? So let me focus a little bit on the currency conversion issue, which is one of the challenges. The sources that we critique in our paper, they apply an adjustment called purchasing power parity, or PPP, to convert spending in Chinese yuan to a common international dollar for comparison. Now, why do they do this? In a less developed economy like China, overall price levels are going to be lower than in a more advanced economy like in the United States. So prices for equivalent goods based on low-wage labor are going to be lower in a less developed country. Those things could include food, clothing, housing, construction, wages. And if you use the market exchange rate to estimate China's ability to purchase those kind of goods, you could underestimate China's purchasing power. For example, the overall economy-wide PPP indicates that China's purchasing power is about 1.6 times the market exchange rate. Now, while this PPP adjustment could make sense, when you're looking at defense spending in practice, some analyses apply it incorrectly, they apply it inconsistently, or in ways that really just don't make sense in terms of comparing modern military power. It might not really click or might not be intuitive that it's possible that China has a purchasing power disadvantage at all. I mean, after all, China is a manufacturing powerhouse. How can it possibly be that equipment and technology could be more costly for China than it is elsewhere? And that is an important topic. It is something that we can understand both intuitively and analytically. So let's start quickly. Analytically, the reason is that there are barriers to trade. There are learning curves that impose costs on a developing economy as it tries to move up the technology supply chain. And in some areas, things can be more expensive because of those learning curves and barriers to access technology. The intuitive one is to just, all of us are familiar with the iPhone teardown, okay? You take an iPhone that is manufactured or assembled in China and exported from China, and you look at it, and 70 to 80% of the components, when you take it apart, the chips, the screens, the software, come from imported components, and only the least expensive parts of it are actually assembled or added in China. So intuitively, I think people can understand that the value can be a little bit out of line with the apparent manufacturing prowess. I'll mention 3 problems, right? So first, if you do use PPP exchange rates, you should use the appropriate exchange rate for the appropriate type of spending. So for example, if you're going to look at personnel costs, wages. But if you're going to look at things like equipment, you should use an exchange rate that applies to machinery and equipment. China's going to get a big boost in apparent equivalent defense spending when we look at wages. This brings us to the second issue. In military terms, the most lethal capabilities are in technology and equipment. And the PPP data shows that China actually has a purchasing power disadvantage in equipment and technology relative to the exchange rate, not an advantage. For example, I noted that the economy-wide PPP indicates purchasing power of 1.6 times the exchange rate, and for wages, it would be even more. But in the area of machinery and equipment, which might apply to military technology, the PPP exchange rate is only 70% of the market exchange rate. This is a point that many recent analyses of China's defense spending, especially the higher end ones, either de-emphasize or they miss it completely. And the third and final point on this one is that, the PPP methodology is meant to compare the same or similar goods. But in the military area, a fighter plane, a submarine, even a non-commissioned officer or an infantry soldier, may not be the same or similar when capabilities, training, operational context, and supporting systems are considered. So if you take all of that together, the sources that we're critiquing, they're highlighting a more salient threat from China by using PPP to inflate the least lethal capabilities the most, and we don't think that that's a helpful approach. What you don't want to do is really emphasize only the advantages, or for that matter, only the disadvantages. And that's what I think some of these highly precise econometric approaches to using PPP for China apply to. And as a result of trying to achieve that precision, they sacrifice almost all relevance and accuracy.
The problem when you're talking about PPP is it's not intuitive because especially when you think about a developing country, it's like, well, if they have cheap labor, everything should be cheaper, without recognizing the fact that if you're trying to create new technology that your economy can't currently produce, you may have to spend way more, right? Either on imports or on developing your own technical expertise and industrial base to be able to produce, right, cutting edge equipment. And I think that gets lost when just recognizing that China has a relatively low wages. It still might just be easier to do a like-for-like comparison of market exchange rates, right? Yeah. Without then going through all the dark magic, the dark arts of economics, because other analyses that use other factors, like those that really focus on labor, are really like, this is a strongly held conviction, right? And that kind of essentially rejects, right, what the World Bank is doing with the ICP program that comes up with these PPP factors. So sort of in simple terms, right, that would be at a close approximation that will probably work. Neither is perfect, right?
Thank you. That's really helpful. I wonder if anyone else, maybe Taylor, has anything to add about how you derived your numbers when doing this comparison of like for like. What did you add or subtract from estimates of U.S. and PRC defense spending?
Thanks. That's a great question. Just to underscore Eric's original point, right? No two countries include the same categories, right? And so if you want to make a justifiable, robust comparison, you have to basically be comparing the same thing. Right? Otherwise, when you apply your currency conversion factors, they're going to be off base. So our approach is pretty straightforward. We started with the official defense budgets from both countries, right? That's the basis or the baseline. And then to China, we added roughly spending in 4 areas. The first is the People's Armed Police, which is a paramilitary force that's focused on both border and domestic security, but also has some reserve capabilities. We also included the China Coast Guard, which is now part of the People's Armed Police, but this is relevant in a minute to what we added on the US side. We also included a line item for defense-related research and development, not part of the official budget. And then we included payments that are made to demobilized and retired military service members. A lot of these are things that other people have added too, but it's not everything other folks have added, which I should mention, right? A recent report from AI adds all of China's space budget because of its military links. We do not do that. And then on the US side, basically 2 main categories. First, the Department of Homeland Security, right, which includes the US Coast Guard, has a very significant role in domestic security. And then the Department of Veterans Affairs, right, which basically corresponds to the category of payments and benefits to demobilized service personnel in China, right? And so once we add all those up, we're at least given figures that we can sort of use to do this PPP analysis. One thing I would add here, which George didn't get into, and anyone listening can sort of look at the very detailed appendices on the website, but we break out into some detail how to apply these PPPs to these different components. And so that's another area where we hope we're sort of adding to the analytical conversation by showing not just that we're making a like-for-like comparison, but we're trying to be fairly granular in what PPPs we use for which parts of Chinese spending.
That part of the article I really enjoyed very much. I thought it was a real contribution to the field. And thanks to all 3 of you for the effort that went into that. I wonder if anyone, maybe George, had anything to add on how this analytic approach that you used is different from some of the previous comparisons of U.S. and PRC defense spending that we mentioned earlier in the discussion?
Thank you, Maryanne. The main points, compare like for like and use an appropriate PPP. Those are things. But I think maybe I'd add two additional points that we bring forth in our paper and that are missing from many other recent analyses, especially those that are concluding that China's defense spending is nearly the equivalent of U.S. defense spending. So the first of those points is, we argue that budget analysis has to take account of military relevance. This means both in terms of lethality. On balance, technology-based systems are much more lethal than labor-intensive forces, and also in terms of, the most relevant militarized conflict scenarios. And those are on China's periphery. And again, that's an area where labor-intensive forces are much less relevant than technology and equipment. Now, the second point I think we argue in this paper that's a little bit different than other recent analyses is that we're saying, defense budget analysis has to be complemented by assessment of the material capabilities that the budget is meant to be procuring and deploying. And we showed in the paper, although we couldn't do an absolute full comprehensive assessment in the space that we had, we showed that although China is modernizing rapidly and certainly can pose military challenges and problems without actually catching up fully to US capabilities, China has fewer modern naval and air platforms with lesser capability than would be implied if China was actually spending the equivalent of, say, $700 billion a year on defense.
There are challenges to doing the budget assessment, to doing what we did or other people do. We've discussed those. I think the much bigger challenge, though, is for people who aren't versed and didn't spend 2 months doing this, people in the media who then have to report on it as part of another story. And this is where we probably get into even bigger problems, because what we're really talking about and what we've really written about is how you think about and understand defense budgets, not sort of what that top line figure is. So I'll give you one example of how these things are very frequently gotten wrong when they get to the media. This one's not strictly media, but it happened in almost real time, so I found it intriguing. And that is, if you go to the Wikipedia page now for Chinese military spending, there is one sentence on our paper that just says, Fravel, Gilboy, and Heginbotham found that China's actual spending is $474 billion, right? So it didn't report that our point of comparison to the United States is 1.3 trillion, which is not at all our official military budget. So it didn't put it in the context of comparing apples to apples. And it suggests, if you just read the sentence, that China is sort of hiding half of its military spending, when in fact, much of that difference isn't stuff that's off budget, and the off budget stuff isn't hidden, but that much of that difference is in fact accounted for by a different exchange rate, right? So, I think it's very difficult for people to understand what the fairy dust is that's being sprinkled on the budgets to get these big changes. And it's almost invariably reported as China hides half its budget, again, without discussing the fact that, a lot of the costs of U.S. Retired soldiers and many other costs, nuclear budgets, et cetera, in the U.S. are not included in U.S. defense budgets.
Thank you. I wonder, would it be possible for you to provide a specific example of how your approach for developing a balanced and accurate military purchasing power parity would be different from other approaches for estimating the cost of the PRC producing maybe a specific asset like a naval vessel or an aircraft carrier or a missile, so that people could try and understand this difference a little bit more concretely?
Sure. Well, first, I just want to amplify one thing that George just said, because it is important, and that's the sort of where's the beef question. So, again, if China were really approaching U.S. defense spending levels, we would expect to see a much larger force. But in fact, the U.S. has twice the number of combat aircraft, well more than twice the naval tonnage. We have, I think, 12 aircraft carriers in the water. China has 3. And then we have another 11 small carriers, amphibious assault ships. We have well more than twice the number of vertical launch cells in our Navy, which is sort of a measure of firepower. So, we have very significant quantitative superiority that also applies to the nuclear realm, as well as as qualitative superiority in quite a number of areas. So I think that's an important point to emphasize. So you asked about specific spending figures for specific systems. I'd say a couple of things here. First of all, none of the publicly available estimates, including ours, really builds upwards from individual weapon systems. So during the Cold War, that was done with Soviet budgets. Some people have done some of that with regard to China. So Steve Koziak has done some work along those lines, but hasn't built a complete budget that way. Another issue here is that, we talk about exchange rates in thinking about these things, but we're not really talking in those terms about how much China actually spends, because the money China spends is in renminbi. So we're talking about how we think about how that might equate to U.S. Spending. So if we don't build upwards, how do we do this? And I think this has already been mentioned here. We have 3 categories of spending that China publishes on a fairly regular basis: personnel, operations and maintenance, and equipment. So you asked about the cost of equipment. Fighters, warships, both of those would fall within the budget for procurement. And that's about 37% of the overall Chinese defense budget, at least as it's published. So there's a question about exchange rates and how ours might differ from others. Again, George touched on the general issues, the World Bank PPPs for sectors that we used. I would make a couple of comments about how other people have approached this. I think the first point, or a major point here, is that other organizations that do this regularly, that publish defense spending figures annually. So these are the 2 organizations that I mentioned earlier, IISS and SIPRI. Both of them use market exchange rates. They don't use PPP, and they're quite explicit about why they don't. PPP was originally developed to provide a better measure of social welfare. So aggregate PPP figures, the basket of goods that those represent, really isn't typical of defense sector goods. It's typical of consumer goods. And we're sympathetic to that position. So our position is not that you necessarily have to use PPP, but if you are going to do that, you should get the PPP correct. It should follow from the logic of military power and how military power is generated. I will say that these, very high inflated estimates apply a GDP PPP multiplier. So that's a lot of letters there. But they apply that consumer-based exchange rate that really is not intended for defense budgets or goods to the equipment and to the operations and maintenance portions of the budget. And then they use an even higher multiplier, a bigger, an exchange rate that provides even more inflated figures for the personnel costs.
Okay, thank you. So building up for individual pieces of equipment, we're probably not there yet. And it sounds like there's good reason for that. And some of that has to do with just availability of data. That brings me to another question that I wanted to ask. And I wonder if maybe, Taylor, if you could weigh in on this. When discussing defense spending, it is difficult at times to escape the issue of transparency. Sometimes the information you most need to make an accurate assessment simply is not available. What data was most difficult to obtain? And if you could re-attack this question with additional information that isn't available today, is there any data that you would use that you think might improve the certainty of these assessments?
Sure, right. Great question, Maryanne. So let me try to answer it in 3 parts. So first, transparency affects a number of categories we were not able to include. And this is, I think, both on the US side and especially on the Chinese side. So we don't include spending on intelligence, in part because it's hard to parse out military intelligence from other forms of intelligence. But, as you know, right, intelligence budgets for a reason are not transparent, right? This is just the nature of that category. Space programs, which I mentioned before, right, you have a military component, but it's hard to parse out the military from the civilian component. And if you sort of included all of it, you probably would want to do that on both sides. So we decided just to exclude it. And then nuclear weapons are very tricky. And so here we excluded anything related to the fissile material and warhead programs, because our sort of assumption going in, right, is that the delivery systems, missiles, bombers, submarines are generally part of equipment budgets. The U.S. is more transparent on the nuclear enterprise, but China is not. So we decided to exclude that. We think basically these are pretty conservative exclusions, and especially perhaps on the nuclear side, given the disparity in the size of the two countries' nuclear forces, even though China is catching up and catching up quite rapidly. If we had all of the data we wanted, I think it could actually sort of widen the gap a little bit between the U.S. and China and not sort of narrow it. So these were relatively conservative choices. So we just like more data to be more accurate in terms of being able to include more categories. Second area has to do with China, right? So Eric mentioned the categories, right? And that's kind of, these are very lumpy, right? And in stark contrast to what one can get from the DoD Green Books, which, by the way, you need a certificate in sort of DoD budget speak to understand them. So there's a different transparency there. We went back and forth on a number of items, so we wanted to get the U.S. number right, and that was surprisingly more challenging, even though all the information is there. You had to sort of know where to look and how to assemble it, and we were able to talk to some people and do that. But with China, right, there's nothing like a green book. And so the biggest gap here is that we would love to have more granular data from China so that we can have a more accurate understanding of within these three large categories what they're spending, so that in turn, right, we could apply sort of the relevant PPP factors more accurately. Then the third area is somewhat of an odd one, but I think is worth including. I haven't mentioned this with my colleagues, so they may jump in and say, Taylor, you're wrong. But there's sort of two parts here. One is corruption, right? This also applies to China, right? There's some apocryphal stories about corruption in the PLA, right? And so we're sort of assuming that everything in the Chinese budget is actually spent on defense and not spent on luxury villas, gold bars, you name it, or it's spent on platforms that simply won't work, right? I mean, we don't know exactly what happened in the rocket force, but it was obviously quite serious and quite high level given the personnel who were implicated in that. And so I think that's a really significant issue. And then I think going forward, I think we're going to have to get a better understanding of maintenance costs in China, because China's at this weird stage where they've built a lot of new equipment but haven't spent 30 years trying to maintain it. And when you look at budgets over the life cycle of a platform, right, it's the maintenance costs that really kind of get you down the road. And so that's another area where we'd like to have more information from China. So like absolutely more transparency, especially more granular detail from China would help us, I think, make a more accurate assessment. But everyone who's trying to make these assessments is working with the same budget numbers from China, right? So it's not the case that one estimate has sort of better insight into the budget than another estimate. It's more sort of manipulated to make something that's comparable.
Non-transparency on data is not in China's interests, okay? And that applies to non-transparency on economic data, which is becoming a big problem these days for China's own economic decision-making. And it also clearly is related to military spending, defense-related spending as well. So what happens when China refuses to be transparent about what it's doing in the military area or what data on military-related or defense-related spending is that the gap gets filled by inaccurate estimates, most of which on the U.S. side the ones that get the most attention on the U.S. side are quite inflationary, right? And I think that ultimately can have some negative consequences for China in terms of the security competition between the two countries. But non-transparency hurts China more than it hurts us.
That's a great point, George. I guess I would add to that, China has become less transparent over time, not just generally, but in the military area specifically. So it used to be possible to wander into PLA bookstores and see what the PLA was publishing. Now, this is not a commentary on our ability to wander into PLA bookstores, but there's a point here, which is that in those bookstores, when we could wander in during the Hu Jintao era, at a certain point, the PLA was publishing books on transparency. And, the first chapters of those books were on why transparency is important. And those books, as far as I can tell, are no longer being published by the PLA. And in our research, because we've done some of this over time, we had an earlier look at this, an earlier iteration of some of this work. And between that point, which was in the early 2010s, and today, China's budgets have become less transparent.
So is it that this lack of transparency is really, it's creating an opening for people who are maybe less sanguine on China to fill the void with data that's maybe less rigorous because the PRC is not offering an answer, and so
yeah, and I mean there's some analyses which just say, well, China must be hiding something, and we're just going to plus up for that. It's like,
yeah,
without saying what is being hidden, right? So it's just a presumption that that something is missing in order to, shape the debate in China's favor. So something has to be added, but what that something is not based on anything other than one's assessment about, or one's assumptions about China, right? There's nothing out there that this is being based, but literally, like, this is in print, right? And out there. And so you could say, you could imagine, and I think I'm not sure that some very early DoD estimates did this. They may have just applied a very straight conversion factor. I'm thinking of some of the military power reports, like from 2 decades ago. So, hey, dating myself, but I think everyone here read those reports 20 years ago. But they were not very, they were just like, well, everything must be higher in China than it is in the United States. So they had just like general conversion factors. I don't even think we're based upon PPPs. It's just like China must be spending 50% more than what they say. So we'll plus up by 50, we'll multiply it by 1.5 and then convert at market exchange rates. I mean, so I think all these arguments are possible because it's very hard to say, well, that's not analytically defensible when China itself is not providing or is providing less data that might make it more analytically defensible.
Yeah, that was part of why I was asking, like, why is this so difficult? Because I think sometimes estimates that seem inflated, it's easy to dismiss them as politically motivated, when sometimes I think it's just that this is a really challenging question to answer with the data that's available. But I see the economists going, I'm not so sure about that, so maybe I'm wrong.
No, I think you're right, Maryanne. So I'm smiling because this is an important issue, and I think certainly people who have the capability to use Chinese language sources the way the three of us do have a certain advantage in kind of digging around, whether it's in Ministry of Finance data or some other things. But I wanted to say something. That's not an excuse for getting it wrong, right? But it does explain some differences in our analyses. Let me take this issue of transparency in China's interests just one step further. So we've already been over the idea that transparency is worse for them than it is for us, primarily because it leads to, I think, security competition that isn't beneficial to China. But if we combine that conversation with what we were just talking about, the analog between the military side and the economic side, I think, is maybe delayed but strong, right? So on the economic side, lack of data is contributing to poor decision-making on the economic policy for China, internally for China. And, lack of transparency on military affairs, including spending data, but other things, as Eric alluded to, is going to reduce the ability of the Chinese military to self-correct, right? And after all, self-correcting institutions are the way that institutions emerge as more competitive than other institutions, right? So this thing about transparency, it's not, China wouldn't be doing us a favor by being more transparent. It may actually have benefits for everyone by reducing some elements of the security competition, but more transparency on the Chinese side would be more beneficial to the Chinese side.
Great, thank you. That was really thought-provoking. All right, final question, and I'll address this first to George, but then anyone else who would like to jump in. Looking at the findings from your research, what insights would you like U.S. policymakers to draw from this comparison of defense spending of the U.S. and the PRC? And what do you think these findings suggest about the state of U.S. and PRC relations now and into the future?
Okay, yeah, I certainly want Eric and Taylor to jump in here. Maybe I'll just start with 2 points, right? So, first and foremost, there's no excuse for getting an important national security related estimate wrong, right? We want to get assessments that are as accurate as possible and as relevant to specific challenges as possible. We don't want to underestimate and we don't want to overestimate. Both of those could produce deleterious effects. I think the second thing, the debate about aggregate defense spending can actually distract our attention from more salient issues, right? So the more salient issues are what specific kinds of capabilities the United States, should be procuring in response to China's ongoing military modernization. Related to this, the aggregate spending debate, China's spending $700 billion and it's almost as much as the US, that kind of thing. That kind of debate could lead us towards a focus on more prominent, big ticket, media friendly kind of stories and items. For example, naval shipbuilding, which may be very important, but also there may be issues that are even more important, right? So for example, the quantity and the quality of munitions and the manufacturing capability for munitions, or base resilience. These things might be more important for success in some of the most likely conflict scenarios. And this kind of aggregate defense spending debate, especially when it's exaggerating, really takes attention and leadership attention away from those potentially more important issues. Taylor, Eric, what do you guys think?
I don't have a lot to add. I think that was a great statement. I guess from my perspective, I would like U.S. policymakers simply to have a more realistic understanding of China's strengths and limitations. Part of this is budgets. Obviously, the three of us believe that we should be more focused on capabilities, but these sort of, wilder claims about the Chinese budget and how they can leverage, cheap labor with some of these costs based on, farm wages, given the number of farmers in China, I think are distracting and misleading. We are at something of an inflection point. Maybe we're always at an inflection point in Asia policy, but certainly, a lot of ideas have been put on the table about America's role in the region, with some people saying that, our commitments there are not defensible given shifting military capabilities. Other people are quite sanguine. Our position should not just be based on capabilities, but it will clearly be informed by what we can and cannot do. And, it's incumbent upon us to do the best we can to understand, again, both strengths and limitations. And so George mentioned shipbuilding, and since he did that, I will say, if China got this enormous benefit from having cheaper labor, we should expect that China would have world-beating, aircraft industries. They don't. Their very first commercial aircraft flew in 2023 with the Chinese Airlines, and it flew with Franco-American engines propelling it. So China does not have these world-beating capabilities. Shipbuilding is a different industry. Obviously, China has real strengths in that area. But let's take shipbuilding. If you look at Chinese military exports, they do export Chinese ships, the hulls for ships. But if you look at the figures for onboard sensors, for weapon systems, for missiles, anything that might go on a ship, their exports are actually very, very small. So a number of countries buy Chinese platforms, especially ships, and then equip them with foreign, usually Western electronics, missiles, weapon systems, what have you.
Thanks. Taylor, anything to add?
Sure, I'm batting cleanup here, so it's hard to add anything. Maybe one point, and this was actually one motivation for the article, in addition to reading the estimates, but there is legislation before Congress, right, about how to estimate China's defense spending. And so when we decided to write this, we hope we'd also inform that decision, right? Because it will be very consequential if Congress passes legislation in that area. We're not saying we have like the right approach or the only approach, but we wanted there to be a sort of well-defined PPP-based approach that could inform thinking about sort of how to do this, right? Because whatever Congress decides, if they ever end up passing that legislation, will have, I think, a pretty significant impact on future U.S. estimates. And so hopefully this provides a resource that can be used as our representatives consider this question.
I agree. This article is a really important contribution to that dialogue. I want to thank all of you very much for today's discussion. And I would also like to thank the National Committee staff who, behind the scenes, helped to make this interview possible. If you enjoyed it, we hope you'll return for future National Committee programs.
I don't imagine that the US or the Chinese governments really had much of a response to this wave of migration.